Hello again, and welcome to this interview in the series that is all about empowering a league of extraordinary mothers on how to use the power of food to get the body we love, more energy, and get back that zest for life we crave. Today, I have with me Helen Padarin. Helen is a naturopath, nutritionist, medical herbalist, and author who is on a mission to educate and promote awareness about the power of a truly nourishing diet and lifestyle for everyone. Thank you so much for being with us, Helen.
Such a pleasure to be here, Edwina. Thanks for having me.
I feel like you were the bonus. We only connected, well after I had lots of people already signed up and I actually thought I'd done, but then I heard from you, I was like, oh no, I can't let this opportunity pass.
Well, I'm glad it all worked out well in the end.
Yeah, it did. So Helen, let's start by introducing who you are to our audience that don't know you and how you came to be doing the work that you do.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, in my professional life, I'm a nutritionist, naturopath. I've co-authored a few books, both with Pete Evans and Charlotte Carr, but also I've contributed chapters to textbooks, so clinical naturopathic medicine, and I've written about pediatrics and ASD and that kind of thing. So yeah, my professional world is kind of the result of my personal experience, really, growing up. My health as a child was not fantastic, largely because I tried coming into the world 3 months too early. And so interventions were put into play to keep me in the oven for longer, right? So I did end up fully baked. However, the interventions that were required for that to happen did have, I think, we only ever know one outcome in life. We can't know what the alternative would have been, but looking back at it with the knowledge that I now have, I would say that process greatly disrupted both my microbiome as well as my mum's microbiome, and that has had follow-on effects from that. So within, before I was 6 months of age, I was covered in eczema. Just had to touch an egg white and I'd come out in hives head to toe. I had asthma from about 18 months old. I just remember during my primary school and teenage years, the alarm would go off at 7 a.m. and I'd reach over and turn that off and pop my antihistamines and take my puffers. It's just was not an ideal scenario. Then in high school, bronchitis every March pretty much. I had a lot of tonsillitis growing up as well. Fortunately, I still have my tonsils though. So there were lots of rounds of antibiotics thrown in there. Pneumonia in year 9, shingles in year 11, depression through much of my teens and early 20s, polycystic ovarian syndrome. And in hindsight, I would guess that it's very likely that I had endometriosis for, a good 10 years. And with the course of all the evolution that's happened with my lifestyle, that's all, everything's working nicely in that department now. But there was many years of heavy bleeding, extraordinary pain to the point of vomiting. And it just sounds like a mess. It sounds impossible for one person to have gone through such a thing. But unfortunately, that is the case for a lot of women. And illness or disease never happens in isolation, right? It's always a systems process. We're very much geared to look at things in isolation these days and put a label on this and a label on that. But really, all of those things that I just mentioned were all very intricately intertwined, even though they sound totally unrelated. If you actually look at the underlying mechanisms of gut health, immune health, the connection to our neurological health as well, then it's no wonder now, knowing what I know, that I felt how I felt.
Yeah.
But for me growing up, that was normal because I didn't know any different.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I started to feel better that I would look back kind of in shock and go, my God, no wonder I felt the way I felt, and thank God I don't feel like that anymore. So I can say now that I feel so much better than I did 20 years ago. So I don't prescribed the whole thing of, you have to feel worse as you age. That's definitely not the case. And I plan to continue that pattern for many years to come. So getting better, because it is an evolution. And I think, that's something that is really valuable to keep in mind, that when we're looking at optimizing our life and increasing our health and our happiness, it's not something that we can just, snap our fingers and resolve overnight. It's something that takes time. It needs to be done in bite-sized pieces, one step at a time, because it needs to be sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, we go back to old habits, and then we have old problems. And who wants that? Like, I certainly don't. So sustainable change is what we need in bite-sized pieces. And it becomes an adventure. It becomes more enjoyable as time goes. There's always going to be, periods where it's like, oh, really, something else? Or, there's going to be periods of frustration and challenges in life that goes without saying. But as we start feeling better and better, we need less and less motivation, because we get more and more inspiration, right? And I find at the beginning of a journey, sometimes we need to muster that motivation. We need to be a bit disciplined to make the initial change, because to start off with, it looks like we're looking at Mount Everest, and it seems like an impossible task at times. And that's why it's so crucial just to find one thing that's really achievable for you to do. And then once you do that and you get the payback from that, and you feel better, you're sleeping better, or your energy's better, or your mood's better, or your cognitive functions better, whatever it might be, or you're not getting colds and flus all the time, then that kind of gives you that inspiration, and inspiration gives you energy. So then you don't need so much motivation, which is nice. And it becomes more of, I like to look at it as an adventure. I'm an adventurous kind of person, so that kind of approach appeals to me. And then it's like, oh, what else can we, experiment with or try out, or how will I feel if I do this? And so that is essentially what led me to what I'm doing now.
So did you meet a naturopath along the way, or an integrative doctor, or what was the tipping point?
I didn't. My family never saw any naturopaths or natural health practitioners at all. I guess I was always a little bit of a black sheep in some ways in the family, thought a little bit differently. However, my sister actually played quite a role. So she's 10 years older than me. And when she was 25, she moved back home. She was expecting her first baba. And she had done a short course in massage and aromatherapy, and she happened to have an aromatherapy book there. And I was really interested in nature. I was always a bit of a greenie. I was always outdoors, and I thought that maybe I would be a park ranger or something like that, because I didn't want to be stuck at a desk all the time. I wanted to be outside. But always had a very caring nature as well. Like, even I look back now at photos that my parents have taken when I was, 3 years old, and how I'm caring for little children at that age. It's always just been a very natural instinct for me. So I read through this book, and I was making my own skincare and things like that. And then when my beautiful niece came along, if she ever got sick, I would look up the book and check out the oils and use the oils. And I'd notice she'd respond really quickly. And so that started me thinking, okay, there's something in this. And so I started looking into it more. So I would have been in, year 10 then. And in year 11 and 12, started going through the process of deciding what it was I wanted to do after school. And traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture and naturopathy just kept coming up whenever I do questionnaires and things like that, and nursing. So, I looked into those, and I thought, oh, this sounds pretty perfect, because it brings into play the nature side of things and the caring aspects. And so it was kind of a perfect fit. And I guess it was through studying that, yeah, my own health started to really evolve as well, which was a really nice side effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I relate completely. I just, it was having to get to a place of being so unwell that you start to do your own study, and then, the shifts happen from there. And it just is such a common story, but I love hearing it, and I love telling it. And because I just feel that it empowers women, we can take on this learning ourselves. And, now everything's at the touch of a keyboard.
Yeah, that's right. We're very fortunate these days with
Yeah.
the access to information that we have.
Yeah.
Funny thing as well, like I think it's really important for people to remember, and this comes up a lot for me when I'm talking to teens in particular, well, to anybody really. Yeah. If your normal has not been well your entire life, you often don't even know to go and research or investigate. Yeah. And when I was, the first thing I remember going to the doctor for, apparently I vehemently disliked doctors as a child as well, so it was hard to get me to see one. Yeah. However, when I did go, I do remember the first thing I ever went for was constipation. Yeah. So there was gut issues for me from very, very early on. Yeah. And, that would change throughout life, but there was certainly always more of a tendency to go that way. Yeah. But later on, I would get these episodes of loose stools and, running to the bathroom after finishing my bowl of oats in the morning. But again, I'd never really known what a normal poop was. And so I didn't really think anything of it. And it wasn't until I actually started spending time in clinic. And so I'd been through 4 years of study. And theoretically, I knew about digestion and bowel habits, but it had still never clicked to complain about what I was feeling. Yeah. And then when I started seeing patients, and patients were coming in with these bowel issues, and I was like, oh, that's what I've got, or that's my experience. So I thought, okay, I better get myself tested here. Yeah. So I took myself to one of the GPs that I work with and asked them to check me for, celiac gene and gluten antibodies and that kind of thing. And lo and behold, even though I was on a lowish gluten diet at the time, there was still moderate levels of antibodies there. So yeah, that was in my early 20s. So that's when I started coming off gluten basically. And now I'm closer to 40. So that was quite a while ago. And I never bothered going down the path of having an endoscopy done to see whether I actually have celiac disease or not, because the difference I noticed was proof enough for me. And I didn't want to be going back onto those foods for 6 weeks just for them to say, that food doesn't suit you. Yeah. I could tell them that. So
we've become very conditioned to need a diagnosis, haven't we? When for so many of these things, whether it's an autoimmune condition or whatever it might be, the treatment so often is very similar as far as diet and lifestyle.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a couple of good points in there. One is that our bodies are incredibly wise and it speaks to us daily. It just doesn't use words, which is what we're used to communicating in. Yep. It uses signs and symptoms. And so we just have to take a moment to listen to what is being said, and we get a lot of clues as to what's going on. Yep. And there is so much wisdom in that, and there's so much information we know. Most of the time we know what it is that we need to do, right? So as a beautiful friend, Dr. Libby Weaver, says, why is it that we know what we know, but we do what we do? Yeah. And so there's a whole other realm to go into there around the psychology of it all. However, our body will tell us what it is that we need. And secondly, regardless of the diagnosis, I often feel like a broken record, and sometimes a little bit ridiculous and unnecessary because I'm saying the same things over and over, you know, whether it is a fungal toenail infection or depression or an autoimmune disorder,
Yeah.
the approach is largely the same. And people might at first think, that's just ridiculous. How on earth can that be?
Mm.
And as I mentioned before, everything in the body is connected.
Mm-hmm.
It's a systems thing. So if something is going on somewhere, there's going to be imbalances happening somewhere else as well. And I like the model of looking at recovering health more from the point of, rather than what do I need to do to treat this disease, what do I need to do to get well?
Yeah.
They're two very different ways of approaching things. Yeah. And when we look at what we need to get well, then that covers everything. Everything falls under that banner, because one thing that, you know, I'm often talking about as well is that humans are just the strangest species. Okay, we're really weird. We forget, we look at nature, you know, and we go, wow, isn't nature beautiful? We look at a sunset, we go to a beautiful national park, whatever it might be, looking out at the ocean, isn't nature beautiful? But we forget we're actually part of nature, and we're one of those animals that we're admiring out there. However, our species has kind of got to this point where we think we've outsmarted nature. We think we can, you know, have all these convenience foods and time-saving things, and not get enough sleep and not drink clean water and live outside of the rhythms and the laws of nature and get away with it. And when we don't, we're like, I don't get it. Why am I not getting away with this? You know, I should be fine. But the key factor is to regain and maintain our wellness. We actually need to remember we are animals, we are part of nature, and just like koalas and kangaroos, we need to live by the laws and the rhythms of nature, and that's what gets us well. And that's basically sums it up.
Yeah, it does. I'm with you. So when we talk about signs and symptoms, we have a very powerful sign that our body gives us, hopefully every day, that lands in the toilet.
That's right.
That gives us a really good indication of our health. So let's talk poo. Let's talk poo, because nobody else has, and it's an important conversation. Let's talk poo.
So much better than reading tea leaves in the bottom of the bath. What you want to do is read what's in the bottom of the toilet bowl.
That's right.
Yeah, it is, you know, the window to inside the body and what's going on. It tells us so much. So, you know, from colour to texture to smell to consistency to urgency. Whoops.
That's your phone.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Life. Yeah, so to consistency, shape, colour, all of those things will give us clues as to what's going on inside.
Yep.
And so, where to begin? I mean, a lot of, essentially what we're aiming for, we'll start with that, right?
Yep.
We're aiming for a poo that is well formed but easy to pass. Yep. So we're aiming for something that's a big banana in size and shape, basically, okay? We want it to be a good mid to dark brown colour, not anything pale or yellow or greenish or reddish. So if it changes in colour, then that is generally a good indication that you need to increase your digestive acid production, because digestive acids break down the pigment in food, and bile ends up making it all brown, okay? So, stimulating digestive acids. This is where the beetroot test is quite telling. So if you eat beetroot and you go to the bathroom and you think, oh my gosh, I'm bleeding, and then remember, oh yeah, I ate beetroot yesterday. Actually, that should still come out poo brown. Okay, so if it doesn't, that's a little sign that your body's telling you, hey, you need to stimulate those digestive acids. And there's a lot of things that can help with that. So having bitter foods is really great for stimulating digestive acid production, and tart and sour foods as well. So what happens is those foods stimulate certain receptors on your taste buds, send messages to your brain and down to your stomach to produce more hydrochloric acid. So it gets your stomach prepped for the food that's arriving and enables you to be able to break down your proteins much better, to absorb vitamin B12 and to absorb minerals. Okay, we need that nice high acid content to be able to do that. The other things that are really important for digestive acid production is having enough chloride. So we need to kind of get away from the mentality of being scared of salt, because salt is actually very important for our electrolyte balance throughout our body, but also for our digestive acid production, because digestive acids, digestive acid is hydrochloric acid, and that chloric part of it, that's the chloride that we need to get from the salts.
Yeah.
Zinc is also really important, and we see, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, massive issues with zinc levels because our soils are quite low in zinc. So we need to, you know, eat oysters whenever we can, and pumpkin seeds and things like that. Venison and beef are also reasonable sources, but nowhere near as good as oysters.
Yep.
And depending on our state of health, we might need to consider supplementing some kind of zinc just because of the state our soils are in. So yeah, digestive acids are really important, and I'll come back to that later because it has a flow-on effect for the rest of our digestion as well. Yeah. So we've spoken form, we've spoken colour. Just to go back to form a bit, if it's not a good big banana size and shape, that is telling as well, because if, say, it is skinny and narrow, that can mean there's a lot of impacted feces around the bowel wall, and so just little bits are able to fit through the middle, hence the skinny poos. So if you've got skinny poos, you probably need to do some good bowel sweeping kind of protocols. You might use things like Cyprium or psyllium husks, or you might go and have a colonic or an enema or something like that to help dislodge all that stuff that's stuck to the bowel wall. Obviously, looking at what kind of foods you eat makes a huge difference on bowel health as well. If it's, you know, quite flat and like ribbon-like, then that's a bit of a warning sign to go and get some investigations done, because often that can happen from obstructions where stool is having to squeeze through a squished space, basically, and that can happen if there's growths in the abdominal cavity. The other thing, you know, can get pebble poos and sheep poos and cow pat poos and, you know, soft serve ice cream poos and all of these things. You can go and check all of these out on the poo chart, which you'll get access to. You can stick it up on the fridge at home. It's a great talk point for when guests come over.
That would guarantee that my teenage daughters would never ask anybody to come to our house if I did that.
Well, at least in the bathroom.
Yeah.
I like the fridge idea. I think we need to, you know, it's a good point right there, actually. We need to normalize poo. Yeah. Everybody does it. Every animal does it. Every microbe in your body does it. Yeah. So, yes, it's something to talk about, because as we're alluding to here, it provides us a lot of information. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a few things. You know, transit time makes a big difference on the shape of poo as well. Like if we have a short transit time, so that means the time taken to get from mouth to the other end, then more likely to have loose or watery stools. And in that case, you're unlikely to be able to absorb the nutrients from your food. And so you can get nutritional deficiencies, and zinc is a big one with that. On the flip side, if you've got a slow transit time, then you can end up with quite hard, compacted, pebbly or rocky road kind of poos where it's all kind of clumpy and stuck together. It can be quite difficult to pass. Yeah. So that can be a sign of many things as well, like liver insufficiency or dysbiosis or which is an imbalance of your good bugs and opportunistic bugs in your gut. It can be not enough water, not enough fiber from plants, from vegetables in particular. So there's a lot of different things, but by A, looking at your poo, and then B, looking at your diet and lifestyle, you can get a pretty good idea of how to resolve that.
Yeah.
We don't want to be seeing any food in our poop. If we're seeing food in there, obviously we're not digesting it and not getting the nutrients from it. And we certainly don't want to be seeing any blood or mucus in there. So bright red blood in poop is normally a result of hemorrhoids or fissures, and that they usually result from constipation.
Yeah.
So while they're not necessarily, well, they can be very painful for some people, but they're not necessarily an emergency, but it does require attention so that you are looking after the health of your colon and not developing worse things down the track.
Yeah.
And yeah, if there is dark blood in there, then you definitely want to get some attention straight away, because that means it's blood from further up the colon, and that can be from inflammatory bowel disease or cancers and things like that. So it's really important to get your stool investigated if there are any signs of blood.
Yeah.
Mucus occurs if there's any inflammation. So if you find when you're going to the loo and having a poo and you're passing mucus with that as well, which tends to look a bit cloudy in the water usually. Sometimes it can be quite obviously mucus, otherwise it can just look quite cloudy in the water. But yeah, that's a sign that the mucosal wall of the bowel is inflamed, and that can happen for a lot of reasons. It could be diarrhea or constipation, it could be food allergies, it could be dysbiosis. It does happen in inflammatory bowel disease as well. So it is important to see a health practitioner to address these things if any of those, particularly the blood and mucus, are showing up.
Yeah.
So yeah, when you're going to the loo as well, you want to feel like you have had a complete evacuation, right? Like, that was a good poo. You don't want to be sitting there going, it feels like there's more there, but nothing else is moving. Yeah. So, and you want to be going at least once a day, 1 to 3 times a day is what you're aiming for, and complete poop. So the great thing is, you know, a great poop is really underestimated, because when you have a really good poo and you have a complete evacuation, you actually get a little burst of endorphins, right? Yeah, you're happy chemicals. Yeah. So you should feel really good after a poo, you know, and as I say, you should feel so good that you want to wash your hands, walk out the bathroom and give someone a high five. Yeah, that's when you know you've done a good one. Celebrate those poos.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it really does give you huge insight into what's going on in the body, and there can be so many causes. And these days we do have so much dysbiosis, which again is that imbalance of good bugs and opportunistic microbes. So, you know, there can be overgrowths of candida or yeast, of clostridia, of streptococcus, that, you know, there can even be overgrowths of what are usually good bacteria, so your lactobacillus and bifidobacteria. So it's not that any of these bugs are bad. We typically, normally and healthily have all of them in our gut. It's just in what kind of populations are they, what kind of balance are they in? Because like with anything, too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing, and then they can start causing us problems rather than helping us.
Yeah. I love normalizing these conversations, and I just think it just lends so much power to it. And you know, like we could talk about the post-poo high. You know, we're all after reward for effort, reward for eating well, reward for sleeping well. You know, like that is a very genuine thing, the after poop high. So if you're not getting it,
and sleep is another big one that affects too, and travel as well, because I mentioned briefly before rhythms of nature, and everything happens rhythmically. Everything in the world happens rhythmically. There's a lot of different rhythms, from days to seasons 2 years to our 24-hour circadian rhythm, right? Where different organs and systems kind of kick into gear at different times of day, depending on our light exposure, which affects our hormone production and all sorts of things like that. So our peristalsis, which is that muscular action of the intestines that pushes the contents through, that is heavily affected by rhythm. And so if we are out of rhythm with our sleep, or we're traveling across time zones and things like that, you'll often notice one of the first things that gets disrupted is bowel habits. So we want to, as much as possible, keep in sync with rhythms where we can. And that is another big supporter of good poops.
And obviously, I mean, the other really obvious one is stress. When we're unhappy in here, we're unhappy in there. So that's also a big tell.
And that can go both ways, right? So stress, we can be really tense and holding on to things. And metaphysically speaking, when we're holding on to things as well, that often will relate to constipation. So if you are constipated, one of the questions that you can ask yourself is, what am I holding on to? Not just physically, that one's obvious, but emotionally or mentally, what am I holding on to? What's hard to let go? On the other hand, if there's loose stools and diarrhea and no obvious cause, if you don't have a food poisoning or a parasite infection or Clostridia infections, things like that, barley belly, if there's no obvious cause there, then you also want to ask yourself, what is it that's giving me the shits that I'm not doing something about? Yeah, excuse the language, but there's no better way to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It is quite literal. Same thing, we can go from there to bladder infections. What's pissing you off? There's often a lot of anger involved when there's recurrent urinary tract infections.
Yeah.
So again, we cannot separate one part of our body or our emotions from the other. It is all very much intertwined and connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we just go back? You talked about, when we have impacted stool in our bowel walls. There's a couple of things there. One is bentonite clay seems to be something that people are using at home quite a lot. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so bentonite clay.
Bentonite, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. It is quite a bit. I don't use it a lot because there is quite a risk of it being high in heavy metals.
Right.
So because one of the things that it is used for is that it's a binder, but it doesn't just bind to things in our gut, it binds to it in the environment. So if you are using it, you want to make sure it's from a very clean source, which can be a bit tricky to find even for myself. And that's why I tend to not really go there. And I find there are a lot of other useful tools that one can use. So it eliminates the need to go and do all of that searching. So different binding products that I might use. I mentioned slippery elm and psyllium husks before. They work well for a lot of people. Often if someone doesn't tolerate one so well, they'll tolerate the other a lot better. Sometimes people can feel quite bloated on them, so either smaller dosages or maybe it's not the right kind of fibre for you to be consuming. But typically a lot of people do well. And if anyone is taking Metamucil, then Metamucil is just based on psyllium husk, but Metamucil has colours and flavours and artificial sweeteners in there as well. So ditch that stuff and just go for the psyllium husks if you're using that. And another really good binder is fossil shell powder or food grade diatomaceous earth. And not only is it a great binder, but it's also a really great supportive treatment if people have parasite infections, because microscopically it's quite sharp. Doesn't hurt our guts, but it does damage parasites. It kind of chops them up a little bit. So it can be great for helping in parasite protocols as a mop-up agent. So and binds to toxins as well. There's a few other things like charcoal, but I wouldn't use that every day. I'd only use that when you're having quite a big detox or die-off reaction. It can cause constipation in some people, so you wouldn't necessarily choose that for someone who's constipated. Yeah, and there's other products like Toxaprevent, which are also really good binders too.
Yeah.
So
I've heard mixed reports or mixed thoughts on, you know, doing this big colon clean out and the effect on all our beautiful good bacteria that are hanging out in there. What are your thoughts on doing that? And, you know, can we do this too much? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it needs to be done wisely, obviously, and ideally with the support of a practitioner who's got experience and a lot of knowledge around the topic, because there's the art and the science of things, right, of health. And it's one thing to know the theory, but it's another to know when and how to apply it for any given individual.
Yeah.
So if you might have 10 people who need to do 10 of the same things, but they might need to do it all in different orders for it to be successful for them. Okay. So that's where getting guidance can really help. These days, I think, you know, most people are stressed. Most people are not eating a great diet. Most people have dysbiosis because of our environments, the foods that we're eating, the pesticides on foods, the chemicals in our environment, our antibiotic use, our painkiller use, and our synthetic hormone use, so oral contraceptive pill, steroid medications for asthma, that kind of thing, other hormone contraceptives, they all affect our microbiome.
Yeah.
So with the combination of all of these things, plus the fact that most people are way too sedentary these days, so we're not physically pumping things through our system, most people are going to benefit from doing some kind of gut cleanse or bowel cleanse.
Yeah.
How that is done for any given person is going to be on an individual basis.
Yeah.
But typically speaking, you know, I'm a big fan of, regardless of what anybody's dietary philosophy is, the thing that is pretty much in common amongst everybody's dietary philosophies is a lack of vegetable intake, right? And those vegetables provide our phytonutrients, our antioxidants, our anti-inflammatory compounds, and the fiber that we need to feed our good bugs.
Yeah.
The fibers that we get from vegetables are much less irritating than the fibers that we tend to get from modern grains. And so I think it's very important to put a big emphasis on veggies. And that's one reason why, you know, I run a program called 9v9 as well, which is just a 9-day challenge to get people to eat more veggies each day, 9 cups a day to be exact, based on Terry Wall's protocol. Because just making that one change in your diet can not only affect your guts and your poos, but as a result also your mood and your energy levels and your sleep and joint pains and all of those kinds of things. So getting those good fibers in and getting those plant foods in is incredibly important for good bowel health. And, you know, one of my favorite quotes is from one of my favorite nerd crushes, Professor Alessio Fasano. He's a pediatric gastroenterologist out of Harvard, and he has been known to say the gut is not like Vegas. What happens in the gut does not stay in the gut. Okay. So this is the other area where I feel like a broken record a lot of the time, because again, whatever it is that I'm talking about, again, whether it's fungal toenail infection, mood disorders, autoimmune disease, anything else in between, we always end up needing to come back to look at what's going on in the gut, because our gut is the entrance point in the body for all our nutrients, but it's also the zone where we determine what is allowed entry and what's not. You know, what's a foreign body, what's a toxin, what's a nutrient. And so when we have damage to the gut wall, substances that normally wouldn't be allowed through get through, and we get these systemic inflammatory conditions that then affect the rest of the body. And we can go into how that works too, if you like, as well. But as a result, typically speaking, with any chronic lifestyle related condition, there's something going on with the guts and the bowel. And so for that reason, I do think, most people benefit from some gut and bowel cleansing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I am actually a fan of, used appropriately, even things like enemas and colonics can be very useful. Not for everybody. Like if you've got inflammatory bowel disease, for example, no, that's not for you to do, particularly you know, maybe once you're in remission and you're under the care of a practitioner and it's, you know, everything's in good nick, then maybe. But yeah, we want to avoid getting to that point, right? Balance is, you know, so far from center in that situation that we need to take things more cautiously. Yeah. Bowel cleansing, very important.
We, you know, unbelievably, we're sort of really at the end of our time, but there is something, you know, if you're happy just to talk for another 10 minutes or so, there is a topic that I think is just, I would love to bring up, and that is, we were talking actually before we hit record about, you know, the fear-based conversations that often drive us to feel very disempowered and worried about doing something that's just slightly outside what is, you know, the information that's coming from mainstream or through our news feeds and so on. And I know that you had to face this with one of your cookbooks and a recipe that was put up for a baby formula that wasn't something that you bought in the supermarket. And the backlash from that, I think, for you guys was pretty phenomenal. But we see this, you know, through this series. We've had Professor Tim Noakes on here that spent, you know, years fighting for the right to say, you know, wean your baby onto high fat, low carb. And then Belinda Fettke has also talked about the repercussions of saying something a little bit outside what the food pyramid is suggesting. How do we as mums empower ourselves to feel strong in our decisions when those decisions might not be supported by mainstream?
Well, first of all, I think well, there's a few things. There's getting clear, there's doing research, doing your own reading. We are so fortunate now. You know, there's a lot of catches to being in this age of information where it can be hard to switch off a lot of the time. But one of the fantastic benefits is that we have access to so much information at our fingertips. You know, once upon a time, a decade or two ago, you know, pretty recent history, all of our information we were getting from authority organizations, right? And so there was a lot of trust put in them. And there was the belief that they're doing things for the best interest of the people. But what we now know is that is not necessarily the case. You know, politics, you know, where do you begin? There's a lot of vested interests, there's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of policy put in place by industry rather than from health departments. The food pyramid is a great example of that. The food pyramid was created by the US Department of Agriculture, not the Department of Health. I mean, that in itself should ring alarm bells, right? And yes, that's evolved a bit over time, but it's still got a long way to go. It's still very much a similar picture to what was described 20 years ago. And then we have all of these beautiful people who are sincerely following this advice, trying to really look after themselves and yet getting sick. And this is quite infuriating for me because despite all these well-intentioned, people are still suffering, and not just good intentions, but also action. You know, they're putting action into place and still not getting the results. So doing your own research from a variety of sources so that you get differing opinions and then can form your own opinion is very important. And then secondly, looking for community. When you know what your values are, finding people who share those values so that you're not feeling like the weird one doing the crazy stuff in the corner. When we have community around us, it's so empowering and it's so much easier to stick to our values and live the life that we want to live and that you have the right to live as well. So yeah, do your research, get clear on what your values are so that you know when to say yes and when to say no, and get community around you to support you in that as well, so it's not so isolating. And the beautiful thing now is that regardless of how geographically remote you are, we can still find community here online, you know. And yes, it'd be nice if we could all be in person together, but at least we have this avenue to connect, which is really great. And trying to make decisions for yourself and your family from a point of empowerment rather than a point of fear. And a lot of just a lot of society, really. It's not even just health related stuff, but certainly around health and birthing and feeding children. A lot of it is fear based, and a lot of it is driven by industry again, you know. And hospitals are often funded by pharmaceutical companies, and it's often easier for doctors to be able to schedule births in rather than, you know, rather than to be there for when Bubby's ready to come in the world. So yes, we need that empowerment, and that comes from education. So
I find for myself, when I'm in doubt, I go back to what you were talking about, you know, in this interview, in that nature, we're part of nature, and nature is smarter than us. I mean, so if it's come from nature, then I'm feeling pretty confident that I'm on the right track. If it's something man-made, if it's a pharmaceutical or a synthetic food then I start to question. That's my guiding philosophy, to keep it basic.
And you know, we as humans, like I said before, we think that we can outsmart nature and win over nature, but I can't remember the guy's name now. He had a really good quote about, you know, we think that we can win over nature, but if we do win, we will find ourselves on the losing side.
Absolutely. I know that you have a little gift, and I love it, for our audience. Do you want to take a second to tell them what that is?
So you will all get access to my poop chart.
Yay! It's to go on the fridge, everyone. We want photographic evidence. We want it on the fridge.
Yes, that's right. So photographic evidence, and make sure that you tag Edwina and myself so that we can see it, because that would just make me so happy. And just really get the kids involved with it as well. Get them talking about poo. There's a lot of poo anxiety. You know, a lot of people are quite stressed about pooping. And, you know, that's just sad. We shouldn't be in that state where we feel so inhibited about something so natural. So, get the charts printed, stick them on the fridge or the toilet door, and start talking poo.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, Helen. This has been absolutely perfect, and I can't wait to share it.
Such a pleasure, Edwina. Thank you.
All right, bye for now.
Bye.